Thank you so much for this introduction, Serena. Really nice. I'm so happy to be here, so thank you for the invitation. Also very happy to be here with Jakob in the same session. Yeah, so I will try to share my presentation here with you all. So my talk today is called Conviviality, Anti-Racist Potentials of Local Welcoming Cultures. I'm just gonna make sure that I keep track of the time also. So my name is Karin Krifors. I represent EMS as a teacher, and I'm also a researcher at Remesto at Linköping University. So now I don't seem to be able to change my slides. Wait a second. I should have obviously tried that as well. Yeah, okay, now I find it. There you go. Okay, so I want to start by summarizing some of the main talks, because it's a short talk, so I really want some points to get across. I want to start by saying that I was part of a research project together with researchers Diana Molinari, Anders Nergård, and Hans Albin Seltenberg. This research project intended to study anti-racism and anti-racist social movements. And I have for a long time been interested in the relation between struggles for migrant rights and anti-racism. So I chose in this project that we did together, I chose as my part of the project to look for anti-racism or to understand anti-racism in movements that centered migrant rights and migration. And the article that is included as a reading for those of you who take this course and who want to know more about this research, this article deals with anti-racism in social movements that do not primarily perhaps call their activism anti-racist, but these movements are still understood as anti-racist movements a lot of the times, and often implicitly they make these claims. So that's like a background to why I came into this research field, that anti-racism was an interest from the starting point, right? And then I decided to look at this empirical field of local welcoming cultures and community activism in small towns in Sweden. So one of the points that I would like to make in today's talk is that I think that we need to also acknowledge that the landscape of research on migration and racism, as well then as the sort of subfield to this, which could be a field on that studies anti-racism, is deeply affected by the polarization around these issues that we see in today's political debate. And I think that this is why sometimes when we want to say new things or new things or like nuance our analysis, we need to start looking for a new kind of language also. So this is a point that I want to make in relation to this concept that we are centering today on conviviality. So at the same time as we have new radical social movements, as well as academic theories that demand like a decolonial or subversive language, we also have reactionary oppositions to these social movements and to these theoretical initiatives. So social theory needs to navigate how we represent people and how we represent organizations and social movements when the people that we talk to when we do research also relate to this polarization around migration as good or bad, or racism as it's there all the time or it's never there, that there is a polarization here. And in this work, I also have worked a lot on trying not to be theoretically presentist, to try to avoid taking for granted that the concepts and terminologies that we are really sort of into right now are necessarily like the only concepts that can make sense of the reality that we live in. So in the theoretical work that I have done around conviviality, I've also tried to look back in time, from in particular maybe focusing on like the 1990s and thinking about how we talk about multiculturalism in relation to what we today may call like migrant agency or solidarity or anti-racism. And the second point that I want to make is that in this article, I have also sort of tried to think about being a researcher in ethnic and migration studies and choosing to study places that are not perhaps Berlin or Barcelona in terms of solidarity and migrant politics. And that this has been a challenge for me because, as many other people at universities, I have an urban bias in my network and also in the ways that we read theories and empirical studies in migration. And in this article, I don't really make a firm statement about what the small towns in these rural regions are actually about when it comes to anti-racism. I will come back to this in the lecture, but I sort of want to lift up that there are conflicting narratives about rural multiculturalism. And I have had the focus of looking for community initiatives that can be understood as welcoming and maybe even anti-racist. And I think that it's important to be curious about these narratives so that we don't allow our research interests to immediately fit into an idea that the big city is liberal and accommodating towards migrants, while the small town is reactionary and narrow-minded. So this is also one of the sort of interventions that I want to sort of write my way into in this article. So I also want to say some short things about the empirical material that I have used when I have looked at anti-racism and conviviality in small towns in Sweden. I have visited 3 small towns in Sweden, and when I've been there, I've been doing field work in terms of like observing and participating in meetings and in events. And this could be like political manifestations and demonstrations, but also social events or cultural events. And I have also interviewed members of these groups. It's important to know that the participants in the study are both people who have experiences of forced migration, people who are categorized as refugees in their daily life or have experiences of experiencing racism in Sweden, but also people who are who have lived in Sweden their whole life, who are read as like racialized or read as white, understood by everyone as like Swedish in terms of ethnicity. So it's a mixed group of informants that I have talked to for this. So the community groups then that I have studied, they are a little bit more difficult sometimes to describe because they are so different and they also shift over time. But they do to some extent have the structure of like, they want to have the structure of like village organizations. And if I would have done like an historical analysis, I'm sure I could see like infrastructures of the past, like from the church or maybe other types of structures around mobilization in small towns and villages. But the ways that the participants in these community groups, the members of these community groups, experience these groups, they think about them as like radically new types of groups in these small towns, in the communities where they live. The groups look different across these 3 towns in terms of like who is involved and what their focus is. So I would say that in one town, language cafes was the main thing that they worked with. That had been the continuity of the group from the very beginning. In another town, political work was more prominent, and in another one it was more like culture and leisure activities like sports. One of the groups started because there was massive protests among people who lived in this town when the migration agency decided to shut down the refugee accommodation. So people who lived in the accommodation were very afraid and anxious about having to move. So people came together to try to find private housing, and that created connections, and that created this group. They were also very involved in refugees welcome campaigns. The second one was more sort of really in line with this 2015 narratives of what's commonly called the migration crisis, but could be the crisis of solidarity, and in these municipalities definitely the crisis of refugee reception, where people volunteered in order to find practical help, but also made friends and then started this community group. And the third group was more politicized in the sense that they were politically interested in grassroots organizing, which was also an idea taken up by this association called the Togetherness Association, Tillsammanskapet in Swedish. So they wanted to start this association, a branch of this association in their local community, and then work together on because refugee issues were sort of one of the main dimensions of social and political life locally in many places around Sweden at this time. So it became a natural starting point for this group also. And when talking about the Togetherness Association, then I also think that it's very important when we do this kind of work on social movement and activism to acknowledge that they create knowledge around these social phenomena of solidarity or building community, and it's not the concepts that I come in with necessarily that creates this knowledge, right? So we have an example here from the chair of this Togetherness Association, who wrote a chapter in the anthology called 2015 to the defense of asylum rights. It's in Swedish, but he says that so mobilizing for the right to asylum involves organizing outside of the parliamentary structure. So it could include sort of creating places to meet, soup kitchens, and it's very much this idea of grassroots organizing and mobilization in the everyday life, right? So that also comes from the community groups themselves. Do you mind muting yourself? Thank you. Perfect. Yes, okay. So I will move on now to the theoretical framework that I have used when I have tried to make sense of these community groups and what they mean for anti-racism and for making a change in the lives of refugees in Swedish small towns. So I have been very inspired here by the work of Paul Gilroy. Paul Gilroy has been is a very influential thinker when it comes to post-colonial knowledge, nationalism, race, and political change. And to me, the work has not been to become an expert in one person's theorizing during this work. But for me, reading Gilroy, as well as reading all the academic debates surrounding his work, has become a way for me to situate this work on migrant solidarity and anti-racism in local small towns. To situate it in both within the field of anti-racism, but also anti-racism and the way that it has been academically understood over time. So now when anti-racism is very entangled in specific terminologies around race and identity, it used to also be thought of in terms of multiculturalism, and I think that following Paul Gilroy's work helps us understand that there are many sort of similarities, but also ways that differences and racism has been problematized that we can sort of use today when we think about these phenomena. So in 1987, he wrote the book There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, The Cultural Politics of Race and Nation. And he argues that, like very sort of firmly argues that race and nation are entangled, and that there is no sort of nationalism without racism, basically. And for me, that also helped me make the case that when we go out and study social movements in the real world, we can't really make an empirical like separation between movements that are sort of that question nationalism and movements that are explicitly or like only anti-racist. But in like the social sort of reality, we will find that these are very much entangled. And perhaps if we try to make this abstract separation between movements that question borders and movements that question racism, what we do is that we miss out on opportunities to theorize these together. So it helped me in this, like trying to think about these community groups that may not have said our main thing is to tackle racism in Sweden, but trying to think about how these groups could still be anti-racist, in which ways and in which ways not. In '93, Gilroy wrote The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness. And this was also a very influential book that made the case for understanding Blackness as a political category that is also underlined by hybridity. So that Blackness as a political subjectivity is also a dynamic category, and should not be understood in terms of like clearly delineated separate communities. And then he took this one step further, I think, in the book Against Race, Imagining Political Culture Beyond the Color Line, where he argued that an essentializing idea of race has dominated many anti-racist initiatives and dominant anti-racism, basically, and that this misses out on how there can be very different and very unexpected subjectivities that are sort of hidden under this idea of race, and that these unexpected identities could actually be the ones that help us unveil the workings of coloniality and racism. But the book that I have focused most on is this book from 2004 called After Empire, Melancholia or Convivial Culture. So I will talk a little bit more about this book. So the first part of this book explains coloniality as a form of melancholia. So Gilroy writes about the UK, and he writes about a nation that is that sort of longs melancholically and sentimentally longs for its former glory, a time when there were also sort of a time when we also, or the UK also did not sort of acknowledge difference within the nation. So this former like time of glory for the nation was also a time when there was no racial problem. And Gilroy's argument here is that the melancholia sort of erases the colonial past of the UK, but the melancholia has workings also today, this sort of when the nation used to be great before we had these problems of immigration and race, basically. And the second part of the book then, as you can see here on, I should have had the title on this page too, but After Empire, Melancholia, so that's the first part of the book, or Convivial Culture, so that's the second part of the book. And in this second part of the book, Gilroy describes what he sees as sort of a way to think about the future, to not be stuck in this melancholic past. And he's really interested in like local dynamic cultures, like youth culture, and he's observing different phenomena in East London, where he's saying that you can find this kind of convivial culture that is looking forward, that is trying to work with differences and find ways of living together. So he writes that multiculturalism broke down or was abandoned it was seen as not working. He's saying that multiculturalism, the way it worked in the 1990s, was also a project of elites, a very top-down sort of project of multiculturalism. So when he describes conviviality, he emphasizes the everyday, non-elite practices. He argues that this can be found in local life. And he argues that we can find anti-racist hope in local togetherness and not in this abstract political debate around race, for instance, or what the blackness actually means. And sort of this. So this is his argument. And focusing on this unpredictability that can sort of happen in local areas where people from a lot of different backgrounds meet, and they refuse to make race or cultural difference the main sort of aspect of their interaction. They sort of take this forward. And I think one of the ways that Gilroy, that he talks about like a recalibration basically towards like refusing these cemented and racial ideas of difference. And I have also found Amanda Weiss, the way that she translates this idea of conviviality into how people, when they are met with difference, they can also choose to let differences be. So racism doesn't necessarily dictate every aspect of people's interactions and people's everyday life, basically. So I would say that the first part of this book about melancholia has inspired many research studies on racism and in particular the denial of racism and coloniality in national societies. And the second part of the book has inspired many research studies on like super diversity or multiculturalism and ways that people can live together. But the main thing here is that Gilroy also tried to write about these things together, right? So the book sort of comes together as a dialectic reading of melancholia and conviviality. What Bach and Sina have pointed out as a need to center this negative dialectics of Gilroy, both to avoid that we superficially like celebrate urban multiculture and downplay segregation and racism that still exists, but also acknowledge the hopefulness in these like unexpected politics, the curiosity, the exploration, which we maybe don't get if we only focus on the melancholia part of what Gilroy is writing. So saying something about the results then, when I went out to study these community groups, I found that the community groups practiced a way of letting differences be, differences that were kind of overemphasized in the rest of society. I would say that one of the differences that sort of was named most often was this between like Muslim culture and Swedish culture, for instance, which was very overemphasized in the whole like social like discourse basically. And they tried to practice ways of leaving this, of trying to do it some other way. So not sort of marking or sticking with these different markers of identity like hijab or what you eat, but also more like generalized ideas of differences like language, for instance. So they had a very elaborate way of trying to get around how some people spoke fluent Swedish and some people did not, that we had this seamless like translation going on where people helped each other while at the same time maybe practicing Swedish because it could be necessary in order to get a job in the future or something like that. But they really tried new ways of trying to leave these kind of sort of cemented ideas of a racial or ethnic hierarchy that sort of defines a lot of interactions, the way that they are described in society when we talk about like integration or migration or different kinds of problems. So that there was like an obvious exercise in these community groups to do that I found very inspiring. But at the same time, when you do research interviews about this and people start naming what they do, it's not as easy to capture this kind of radical shift that all the participants also talked a lot about, how they talked about how these community groups felt very, very different from other types of situations that they were in institutionalized settings like the school or like offices or other places that they moved kind of. So there is a challenge in doing research interviews and putting these things into words. And here it was very, very helpful to sort of be in these meetings and see for yourself how these people tried to practice a kind of conviviality, even though conviviality was not part of their vocabulary in like describing what they did. I would say that another result was that gender equality, very sort of broadly, whenever people talked about gender or women or men, was a field where the community, or a field, but it was the kind of setting or a situation where the community groups really struggled to find these convivial, forward-moving cultures that they seem to be able to practice in other kinds of situations. And I think this illustrates what many post-colonial feminists in the Nordic countries and in Europe have written about the relationship to the welfare state and sort of welfare nationalism, and how the idea of gender equality becomes associated to a certain like European or Nordic value, basically, or even what scholar Sarah Ferris is talking about when she's writing about femonationalism. And I think this was also the case in groups where people actually had a lot of knowledge around this, that they also thought that discussions about gender equality and the ways in which gender equality was described as a Swedish value, they were critical towards this, but there were still all these situations that appeared, they were still unable to find new ways to relate to this in what could be like thought of as like finding convivial cultures to deal with these differences, letting differences be, acknowledging that they have to do with racism, but also moving on. They got stuck in these issues a lot. And I think that this also points towards how we need more research on finding like successful ways to counter this in settings there where there is a will to do so. So I know Anna Bredström, for instance, is working on this, but I think in more settings we need to sort of be interested in this, whether there are ways forward in this. And I think last slide here, or second last slide, that studying small town groups and like looking for multicultural culturalism, we also risk ending up in like promoting a new trope where we say that, yeah, the small towns, they have a different community structure, and we can see that migration kind of revitalizes these small town communities, because some of people talked about the revitalization, but they talked about it as about revitalization of a political infrastructure in these communities. But we also do have a conflicting trope in popular culture. For instance, this is an image from a very popular and successful Swedish movie called A Man Called Ove, which is about this Swedish man who's kind of depressed and lives a very like small life, and then he gets new neighbors who are like from a different culture, and they represent life, and they represent him thinking completely different about the way, like his manners, that Swedish culture is so sort of closed, and it opens things up. And that is also a new trope that is sort of maybe uncritically celebrating this idea that just as long as differences meet, everything will sort of progress. But the idea that the negative dialectic reading on conviviality also forces us to continue to acknowledge that racism and coloniality are underlying structures in all of our interactions. Also, it's still there. It doesn't go away because we meet new friends, for instance. And then last slide. what do we gain then by studying anti-racism in rural places? So I would say that I only sort of begun to dig things out when it comes to this, but I think that we could learn new things about the intersections of class, race, and place by studying migration, migrant agency in these places. And I have also been inspired by how Bell Hooks writes about her experiences of moving back to the rural, and how maybe there are things about small towns and rural regions that make us that forces us to question how we think about mobility and cosmopolitanism, and start thinking also more about rooted diversity, and having to care for the diversity that is there and doesn't like come and go, but sort of characterizes many small towns that are not as homogeneous as they are often portrayed. That was it for me. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Karin. Thank you a lot. So for the students, again, don't forget to write your questions